It's a pleasure for me to come and be able to share this morning on the whole question around, can we find a middle ground in how we share revenues for purposes of devolution? But there's a reason why we share revenue in Kenya. And I think a fundamental basis of any government engagement is that there's a social contract. A social contract which means that the government of the day has an agreement implicit in the promises they have made to the people of the country, and the people of the country have an agreement with their government that for the government they shall make sure that there is health care, there is education, there is security, there is water, there are all these socio-economic and political services, and in return the people of the country shall pay their taxes. And the two are non-negotiable, so that there is no conversation about whether you should pay tax or not. It's not a conversation that you can engage KRA. But there also should be no discussion as to whether you get a road, or whether you get water, or whether you get health care. It cannot be a conversation. But be it as it may, we are in that very space where we are having to have a conversation about the leaders we elect and how they should influence the kind of decisions that go. But secondly, is that it's a constitutional mandate. As a prof has mentioned, anytime you decentralize government, you do four things. One, you give a function and expenditure responsibility. You assign certain responsibilities and expenditures. And that happens even in the companies that we work in, that if you have a responsibility, you have a project, you have a program, you have certain expenditures that you can incur for purposes of advancing that cause. But secondly, then you also need to access certain monies, so you cannot just spend. So there's a revenue assignment of money. And in our case in Kenya, we have determined in the constitution that the big taxes, the big four, basically are collected by the national government. That is income tax, VAT, import duty, and excise duty. And then the basically operational taxes or services, charges are collected by the county government. That is property rates, business permits, and the like. But a third one is the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, that between the two levels of government, there should be a transfer model. Commonly, that it's the national government or the national institutions that will transfer to the local institutions, because again, to cure for some of the balances. And the reason being is that you cannot have the same production in every part of the country at the same level, and therefore there are certain areas that definitely would need uplifting, and our constitution uses that language when it talks about equity, that equity is about providing according to the needs, and therefore. But in some countries, even local governments do give money to the federal government. I studied in one of them where basically state governments could actually lend money and give money for certain services to the federal government, again because of how they have organized their tax. And the last one is borrowing. Then we allow our governments that because there are certain fundamental expenditures that are beyond our revenue levels, you will borrow and implement them, and then we shall pay for that through our taxes in the future. That again is an implicit social contract. And therefore our system is a cooperative government, and a cooperative government means that every decision is to be arrived at, if you read Article 1, based on consensus building, cooperation and consensus building, in which national resources are applied for the development of the whole country. And in that spirit, then finance follow functions assigned to each level of government. But a key opening remark for me, I think, is also to note that these processes are political in as much as they are technical. And I think it's important for us to say, we need a conversation in this country of what model of development we want to pursue. If it's infrastructure, I think there needs to be a conversation. If it is social services and human capacities, we need to have that conversation. Because across the country, what you see as development is basically brick and mortar. But brick and mortar is not necessarily development. There are places, there are counties, there are places in this country where you don't need to build an extra structure. What you need is to employ more doctors and nurses. What you need is to employ more engineers and extension service workers in agriculture. But what has been the experience so far? I mean, when you think about revenue, that graph is self-explanatory. The green, I hope you can see it, the green is how quickly our national expenditure has grown. So the line at the very top. take note that about a lot, so this is from 2002. I know some of us really like to analyze over long trends. So we took analysis from 2002 when our budget was about 300 or so billion to now when our budget is 3 trillion. And you see the green line, but then we see the red line, or I think my colleague meant deliberately to put the red line as the total revenue. So that's how our expenditure has grown. The red line is the total revenue. So total revenue here, we are saying both tax and non-tax expenditure. But our ordinary tax collection, the total tax revenue, is the blue line and is the one running at the last point. What basically we are saying that we have not been living within our means. And the deficits continue to grow year on year, even when we are in a spirit of austerity. But saying that, okay, fine, national revenue has been growing in that way, national expenditure has been growing in that way, maybe the solution is that counties are growing their revenues. But then the numbers we have, and these I take just for 1 year, 2017-2018, show this is how much counties collect versus their total share. And you see only Nairobi, Mombasa, Narok, Kiambu, Nyeri, Uasin Gishu, because of Eldoret, and Machakos, and Kajiado can provide more than 10% of their county expenditure from their own source revenues. The rest of the 37 counties have to rely on national revenue. Now, that already starts to send you a message. So when you compare those two graphs, that graph of growing expenditure versus not very much growing. And I was just looking at the numbers right now. When you look at our revenue over the last 15 years, it has grown at 14% on average, year on year. So that tells you a story. But then the story that now brings us to the conversation is then how do we relate this with the equitable growth sharing? Now, what we did here is basically to look at 2015, and we did this with ISPAC, if you need to confirm that this is valid numbers. And Hillary is among the guys we worked with, so I can confirm this is both IBP and ISPAC work. We looked at what is the growth factor. Now, what is the growth factor? The growth factor is the factor that is used to determine from 1 year to another how much should we allocate for devolution. Is it the best approach? Maybe not, because there are other factors that we can look at. For instance, we can look at how services, the cost of services is going. We can look at, we have confirmed that this is the actual cost of delivering certain services, and therefore. So the growth factor that is indicated in column 2 is what CRA has used over the last 6-7 years. So in 2015-2016, 10.4. The third column provides the basis. So for CRA, it was 3-year average growth in ordinary revenue for the 2015-2016. Now we leave 2013-2014 and 2014-2015 because there were a lot of adjustments that were happening at that particular time, including costs that were being incurred by national government on behalf of counties, such as paying of salaries, I think, for health workers in one of the first years there. So the second year, again, 2016-2017, they used the 3-year average. 2017-2018, they used the 3-year average. 2018-2019, they used inflation. And we know we have had our own debates whether that's a proper measure to be, and maybe it was just a measure basically to be able to ensure that we can have a growth that at least takes care of inflation. And I will explain why I think that. On the National Treasury, there are several years, about 3 of them, that we don't know what basis they used. But then for the first year, again, they agreed with CRA 10.4%. Second year, CRA 15%. Treasury proposed 7.8%. 2017-2018, CRA proposed 15%. National Treasury 6.7%. And this year they use month-on-month inflation. And then 2018-19, and this is contested. Now you see 2 numbers for 2018-19 because there was even some revisions that were done. CRA proposed 8.5%. National Treasury proposed 4%. There was no clear basis of that. But then when you look at the column on ordinary revenue, it shows you how, what basically I was saying, that the growth in ordinary national revenue is about 13%, 4%. 2018-19 is 21%, but this is to be explained based on the dip. So every year we have elections, our revenue collections takes a dip. From 2002 to 2007 to 2013 to 2017. Every election year, the revenue takes a dip. So you see 13%, you see 4%, and then you see 21%. So 21% is not necessarily a growth, it's just basically a recovery from an election year, and then we are back to our normal numbers of 14% in 2018 to 2019. I mean, the projected 18%. But you look at the equitable share of what has been approved for counties, 259 for 15-16, 280, 302, 314, which was revised by 10 billion lower. Now there's a whole story around that, and then 16%. But then look at the growth. From 14 to 15, 15%, 15 to 16, 8%, 16 to 17, 8%, 17 to 18, 4%. The proposed was going to be at around 1%, and the figure proposed this year, basically the year we are working with, just shows a 1% growth. In other words, the monies we are allocating for devolution are growing at a very highly decreasing rate, if you were to argue in that reverse language. Meaning, if you were to reduce this amount based on even what has been proposed, we are likely to have a negative. If you insert inflation, you are likely to actually have a negative growth. Now, the reason why we are in the situation we are in is because of the things I have highlighted in bold. So the ordinary revenue, as you see up there, this is excluding appropriations in aid. 15-16, 1.1 trillion, 1.3 trillion, 1.3 trillion, 1.6 trillion, and this year we expect to collect about 1.8 trillion. I think it was going to be about 1.6 or thereabout. National interest, which national interest here includes, I can read for you, national irrigation and fertilizer clearance, youth empowerment, national social safety, so this is the money that is given to older persons, orphans and vulnerable children, child welfare, presidential bursary and severe disability, primary school digital literacy program, and school examination fees waiver. So they take about 79 billion, and this year they are going to take about 94 billion. But our public debt servicing, in 2015-2016 was about 250 billion. We have doubled how much we are spending on servicing debt within 5 years. And currently, we are spending about 52 shillings out of every 100 shillings we collect in servicing debt. But that's not the full story. We have other national obligations, which basically is other national obligations as according to Article 203. We can break that down at a later point. But then we have the untold story of pensions. Now, a good number of you work in the public sector, and one day or another you'll be retiring. Now, a lot of your bosses, and maybe some of you here, are actually retiring this year, next year, and 2022. The reason being, they were the ones who were employed last before the structural adjustment program, the famous golden handshake. And therefore, they are coming to they have already reached their 55 years, they have done their 30 years, and now they are headed into their 60th year, in which then they will need to leave public service. Now, why is that important? Because just 5 years ago, we were spending 54 billion in pensions per month. This is, per year. This year, we are going to spend 109 billion in pensions. And this is the servicing, both the lump sum and the monthly installment. The total stock of pensions, I suspect, is about 2 trillion or thereabout, if you were to calculate all the money that government owes pensioners. And that is a conversation that is worth having with the people in this room. It's a conversation we cannot run away from. I know the CS is now pushing for mandatory contributory schemes for public servants. I don't know how that will go, but that's a story for another day. And therefore, then the money that is left, so after you have deducted all this, and then we are left with about, this year, 323, you're left with about 693, 854, and then now you give about 323, 911, so 323 billion And when you look 323 billion out of 693, it looks like you give 50% of the national revenue to counties. But it's 323 out of 1.8 trillion. There's a conversation that needs to be held there, I think as a country. And this is a question of, does the national government actually run all these services and all these functions, and therefore finance is following functions? So, before you stone me, what then? I think the growing the national revenue remains a challenge in a contracting economy. And how do we know the economy is contracting? Because income tax is declining, and it's critical. Oh yes, thank you. National in a contracting economy, our income tax is contracting. The only tax that is growing are two sources: excise duty and VAT. And of course, you know what happens. When everything is going wrong, let's live now for tomorrow we die. So people are either talking on phone, venting their pains, or just consuming. We become a consumer economy. But import duty, and yet we are a net importer in most of the things that we use, and income tax, which means then corporate tax and payee are declining, meaning that either we are losing jobs, companies are closing down, or even if we are not losing job and companies are not closing down, we are not employing anyone. It's a conversation that is worth having. Non-discretionary obligations, as I've shown, are growing faster than revenues, and we don't have any agreed growth factors. I've shown that we don't have a growth factor of how do we grow both our revenues and how we share that revenue between the different levels of government. Now remember the different levels of government. We are just not talking about Kakamega County. We are basically saying that the county is given the responsibility for provision of healthcare. That's by the Constitution. Are we giving enough resources for provision of healthcare? Are we giving enough provisions for purposes of agriculture? To the best of my knowledge, the last extension, agriculture and livestock extension service workers were employed, I think, in 1985 or thereabout. Yet we say agriculture is the backbone of our economy. Are we allocating the money where things need to be? And clarity on who is doing what, and that's what resources they should be getting. I close by saying then, what then does this mean for us in trying to pursue, even as the theme said, a middle ground in how we share revenue? I think we need to revisit the functions assignment and costing discussion. What does that mean? It means that we need to ask how much of healthcare should actually be delivered at the national level, and how much of it should be delivered at the county level, and be able to allocate resources accordingly. We have a lot of duplication right now. We have a lot of unclear expenses at the different levels. But secondly, we need to find a consensus on the revenue sharing growth factor. I think and this is a political conversation. It's not just a technical conversation. It's a technical conversation, but also it's a political conversation. And I think, among others, ISPAC need to take a role in that. And also ourselves, some of us are working in the very spaces where some of these conversations are held. But the third thing is to revisit the role and value of conditional grants versus equitable share in advancing service delivery. Now, what we are seeing, currently we have about 7 conditional grants. What are conditional grants? Conditional grants are monies that are allocated by the national government that are restricted for purposes of providing and ensuring certain services are provided. Now, 5 of the 7 conditional grants are in healthcare, including the one on maternal healthcare, the one on use of foregone fees, and even if you were to include the deductions on leased equipment program, then you realize that a lot of money that should be given directly to the counties for healthcare is actually managed by the national government. But that's not even the difficult part. The sad part is that money is not necessarily even disbursed at the time it's supposed to be disbursed. User forgone is what pays the casual workers in the facilities, because when people now go to a dispensary, if you've gone to your dispensary back at home or any public dispensary, you don't pay for some of those fees that you paid in the cost sharing kind of arrangement. I think that conversation needs to be revisited, because then it doesn't become a backdoor within which then we sabotage the very goals of our constitutional or social contract towards service delivery. But also addressing service delivery as a corporate goal of different actors, so that what matters is that the person, I receive healthcare services, and it's a corporate goal of both the national government and the county government to be able to work on that. And this basically, I am saying, revisiting the discussion around intergovernmental frameworks. Intergovernmental frameworks in healthcare, intergovernmental frameworks in agriculture, intergovernmental frameworks. The two seem to operate. Almost every government seems to be on a race to the bottom, wanting to be felt on the ground. But as you know, kwa ground vitu ni different. And then finally, I think we need to come back to the whole conversation around the salient aspects of participatory governance in revenue raising and sharing. Again, we have very little conversation going on, participation of different sets of public on how this whole area of revenue raising is happening. We seem to be very fixated on how much we are spending, but very little conversation is happening on how we are raising. How we are cooking the ugali. We keep saying baking cake, but how many people eat cake in this country? So let's talk of relevant things. How do we cook ugali that is sufficient? It may not be enough, but at least it should be sufficient for purposes of our needs and of our daily needs. I rest there. Thank you.